Thank you for joining our fireside chat series today, titled Protecting Critical Cloud Infrastructure from Insider Threats, a financial services company's perspective. My name is Maura Ghazzani, and I will be the moderator for the next 30 minutes. I just have a couple of quick housekeeping items I want to cover. We will open up the fireside chat to questions at approximately the 20-minute mark. So if you do have a question, please use the Q&A box located at the bottom of your screen. You can submit your questions anytime during the discussion and or during the Q&A if you think of something later on. Secondly, I want to let you know that this event will be recorded and available right away on our website at cloudknox.io. Okay, now let me introduce our special guest today from Horsley Bridge Partners, John Roller, who's the CIO at Horsley Bridge, and Joshua Kirks, who's the IT director at Horsley Bridge. John and Joshua have been very kind to join our fireside chat today to give us their perspective and insights on some of the new risks that financial services companies are facing in the cloud, as well as share some of the strategies that you might want to consider implementing in your own organization. All right, let me begin with our first question. Before we really start talking about cloud security, I'd love to have each of you tell a little bit about yourselves and give the audience a quick overview of Horsley Bridge Partners.
Yeah, good morning, everyone. Thank you, Maura. My name's John Roller. I'm the CIO at Horsley Bridge. I've been in the financial services industry for about 22 years, and I've been the CIO since 2015. Horsley Bridge Partners is a private equity fund of funds. We invest capital from corporations, endowments, foundations, pension funds into global venture capital and buyout partnerships. And Horsley Bridge has about $18 billion of committed capital under management.
And I'm Joshua Kirks. I'm the Director of IT at Horsley Bridge Partners. I started with Horsley Bridge back in 2015, and prior to that, I did a lot of financial services consulting.
Thank you so much. Thanks for that overview. Okay, for really our first question, there are few, if any, companies that that have not been impacted by COVID. But even before the pandemic, I think we could all agree that financial service companies were under a lot of pressure to accelerate their digital transformation process just to remain competitive. Your team has really embraced the cloud early on. Could you share some of the kind of rationale behind your approach to move to the cloud and maybe speak a little bit about your deployment model as much as you're comfortable sharing?
Yeah, I think as I kind of moved into the CIO role at Horsley Bridge, one of the first things that we did was develop our IT roadmap of what the next 3 to 5 years was going to look like at Horsley Bridge. And that started as more of a looking at a full cloud deployment. We were totally on-prem at that time. And then kind of one of my first things, I brought in Joshua to Horsley Bridge to implement that roadmap. And we kind of settled on a hybrid cloud infrastructure somewhere in the middle of what we set out to do and where we were. And it's really been an evolution that we've had. I think, as far as some of the COVID things, a lot of our business continuity things and disaster recovery has actually played well into some of our preparation for the cloud stuff. We've really been able to embrace the move to work at home very well and very rapidly. And we can talk a little bit more about that, but I'll let Joshua kind of talk about the implementation of our roadmap and how we really transform from on-prem to a hybrid cloud infrastructure.
Yeah, thanks, John. I think I don't know that we moved to the cloud early, but we certainly moved swiftly. So since 2015, we've done a massive migration of on-prem systems into mostly SaaS, adopting Office 365, getting rid of on-prem Exchange servers. We still have Active Directory, and we still have some legacy systems that just don't make sense to necessarily move to the cloud. And most of our primary business processes were already digital. One of the things we found from the shelter in place, it really forced us to revisit a few things that were not necessarily things that we could do remote. So, one of them is accounts payable, accounts receivable process. It's really hard to print and sign checks when no one's in an office. So we've had to really kind of go back to those vendors, get digital copies of invoices, figure out different payment methods. as well as still getting kind of the traditional mailed version. And as John mentioned with our roadmap, we've been steadily moving to entirely SaaS. And so we're getting rid of most of those on-prem systems and adopting the alternatives through cloud processes, whether it's public cloud services and running kind of our own infrastructure, whether it's managed infrastructure, whether it's just a true SaaS offering. But there are still things that don't necessarily make sense to move to public cloud, whether it's a cost constraint or it's a compatibility problem, or it's something that is really used by so few people. We want to keep it on-prem for whatever reason.
All right, fantastic. What would you say to those financial services companies, and that's probably any organization right now, but specifically financial services companies that are trying to overcome some of the, what I like to call the FUD, but the fear, uncertainty, and doubt that seem to plague the industry, especially right after a well-publicized breach?
Yeah, I think we're highly regulated. We're a registered investment advisor, and we have a lot of compliance concerns and things like that. But it hasn't really stopped us from making kind of this shift to hybrid cloud. We take the approach that it's really about hygiene and security framework behind everything. It doesn't matter if you're completely on-prem or if you're fully in AWS or Azure. And if you still have default passwords on your admin accounts, you're not going to keep anybody out of your network. So I think that's one thing is, a lot of the breaches that occur are really due to misconfigurations and not necessarily because people are, just have things, not within their four walls. So I think that's kind of one, key thing is it's really about cyber hygiene. The other thing for us, I think, is, as a small firm, we can't hire a full team of security professionals. We have Joshua and I kind of running the show. And so, there's a key to kind of the diligence of the IT partners that we pick, ones that can offer secure solutions, but, groups like CloudKnox that allow us to really be partners with them and talk about the product and, things that we can use for the long term. So I think those are kind of the vendor diligence piece is kind of big for us as well. Joshua?
Yeah, and I think, touching on that, the cloud can actually be more secure in many ways than on-prem. You've got a lot more offering. I think there's just a lot more moving parts, and that's where the fear comes in, because it does require a different skill set. It's not a lift and shift in its entirety. I think when people like to say that lift and shift phrase that it's going to be so easy and it's cost effective, but they're not considering all the ramifications of the granularity of what public cloud services offer, even what SaaS offers. And so you really do have to have that security framework in place prior to doing that lift and shift. Lift and shift is really just the administrative component. The logical component of how we're going to access it, how we're going to police that access, how we're going to deal with all those other pieces. Those require some good skills, and I think that's where leveraging great partners, adopting those skill sets in house, but really that has to be wrapped in your framework. And in my opinion, the challenge is not security. It's really how you apply it holistically. So if you're going to adopt cloud, you really need to be able to make sure that that fits in your security framework, that you've planned for it, that you understand all of the elements that you're adopting as you adopt cloud services. And a big part of that is also accountability. Accountability is a really key element here because you must define the responsibility for each element of your security framework. If you're going to use vendors to help you manage public cloud, you really need to establish who's responsible for each of those elements. And then again, that's a big part of your security framework, and make sure your framework is tested. If you're going to on-prem, off-prem, you need to have auditors come in and test, what am I vulnerable to? How has this been applied? If you're vulnerable on-prem, if you've done that traditional model where it's, the M&M, the hard candy shell and the soft middle, and everything has been done in the perimeter, well, your perimeter has just shifted. And so it's really important that you evaluate what is your security stance. And there's a statistic that we actually quoted recently to our executive committee is that 61% of breaches start with third parties. And if there is a breach, it costs you twice as much. And so, if you're going to use vendors to help you with this, it's really important you do vendor diligence. In fact, that's actually a big part of where our budget is going this year. is revamping some of our vendor diligence program.
When so a lot, and I think you said this in your answer, a lot of your strategy was definitely thinking about this before you actually moved to the cloud. Is that correct? I mean, you really kind of did a lot of the due diligence on-prem, and would encourage anyone that is moving to the cloud to spend the time to think about that cyber hygiene or operational hygiene before you even really move most of your workloads into public cloud or hybrid, of course.
Yeah, I think that's actually, it was a key element. We, when we first started moving to even Office 365, we hired a third party to help us. And part of that was to assess what is not only how we're using it today and what our expectations were, but to manage, all of the process change for our users. What's this going to look like? We adopted, as we adopted Office 365, we also had a internal product upgrade, and so there's a different interface for users. There's all these different elements that you really have to manage, and so as you adopt cloud services, like I said, it's not just a move. There's a whole other element. There are all these other elements around it that you need to consider and make sure you're training, make sure that you're considering the security changes, make sure that you really understand what you're getting into. It's not just a simple as just a move.
Thanks. That's a great answer. I think that I'm going to jump and focus on identity for a second here. I'm going to assume that everyone agrees that identity has become the new perimeter, the new digital perimeter in the cloud, and there's really no turning back the clock, right? With that said, what do you think are some of the biggest risks or biggest threats that you believe come with this new reality?
Yeah, the perimeter has changed. I think I agree with you in a lot of regards. Identity is kind of a new perimeter. A lot of times we're pushing things to, we're allowing people to, and even work from home, is that you don't necessarily, most companies don't necessarily have those traditional on-prem firewalls that we're now managing the ingress-egress policy. The idea of that is, AAA is not new, right? The authentication, authorization, and accounting model is not a new thing. What's new about identity is adding context. Context is the new variable for each of these, right? It allows you more granular control of each element. So the goal is to enable users to access what they need. But from a security perspective, we also want to make sure they're doing that in a way that is both managed, that we can apply governance, that we can make sure that it's not that there's not compromise of our data or even loss of data. And so it's really to ensure that we need to understand that context. It's much bigger than just MFA. MFA is a basic security constraint. The idea of context is, where are they accessing from? Is it a managed device? Is it an unmanaged device? Is this a user that normally uses this service outside of the office? And that context has certainly changed. There's certainly more elements of context with a shelter in place. You have, as an example, you might have had staff that their context was expected to be on-prem. Well, now everyone's off-prem. So everyone's working from home, how do we manage that context? And so that is something that definitely has to be managed. And I think there's an element of planning for the return to office, right? You may have had to relax certain constraints or add security elements as people started working from home. You need to understand and plan for what are the changes as we go back to an office that need to happen, and making sure we're training around it, make sure our staff understands that. Those are all really huge elements of the new identity, if you will. And I think from an admin or security perspective, it's really important that we define roles, right? So one of the things around identity, if you're going to add not just context, it's also role basing everything. It's saying, okay, well, here is your job role. Here is what we're expecting you to do. And then right sizing things to that at the identity level. So as you're authenticating, let's authorize you for the role that you're about to, perform, and make sure that everything is right sized.
Okay. All right, fantastic. So as a follow-on to that previous question, what would you say some of the biggest hurdles that you've experienced in overcoming some of these new risks and threats? So you talk about context, but what difficulties have you seen in actually implementing any programs that address this new challenge of identity as the new perimeter?
So there's certainly a lot of challenges. I think, one of the buzzwords that's out there is zero trust, right? The idea of zero trust is kind of a big deal because the idea is exactly what I was touching on, right? Is adding that context, limiting access and defining those roles. It shouldn't be scary or distrustful. The idea of zero trust, even by term, is I don't trust you. It's not about trust, it's about enablement, but we want to make sure that we authenticate and authorize every connection to every app and every service, so that the idea is not that you've authenticated once and now you have the keys to the kingdom. The idea is that you should be evaluated based on each role individually as you use them, and that you're using tools the way you're supposed to do that. That's been a huge challenge for us as a smaller firm, right? It can be extremely challenging when you have a lot of role overlap. So as an example, you have a job role that requires access to system A, but that same user has another role that needs access to system B, to a whole nother set of data. And so now they kind of, before you know it, they have access to every system in our environment and almost every element of data in our environment. So, controlling that access can be challenging in a smaller firm. And I think this is where kind of that third level of AAA, that accounting, that auditing of access becomes essential to your process. Let's look at the behavior as a context, right? So how are people using these applications? How are they using this data? And determine what level of access is really required so that we can right size or even downsize their level of access to exactly what they need. And again, it's about enablement. We don't want to restrict them from doing their job or their role, but we want to make sure they only have access to what they really, really need. And that accounting, that auditing phase is really important. You can use that context to evaluate, when was this last used? How was it used? Does this user still need access 6 months from the project that we originally gave that role? And so that good accounting can really help you establish additional levels of security within your even open framework, if you will. And it's really, really important that you also go back and evaluate that for service accounts, APIs, even whether or not it's an admin that's accessing certain things. Are they doing what you expect when you expect? And is that something that you can right size on the fly? There are tools that allow you to do that. So that's a huge consideration as well.
I actually love the fact that when you talk about zero trust, you talk about it's not about zero trust, it's about enablement, because you don't want to give the impression, it's not about restricting, it's about being productive, but being secure. And so right. I love that term, enablement. Okay, I think we are actually at almost at the 20-minute mark, and we have, so just a reminder to the audience that if you have a question, please type it in the box down below your screen. And for the final question, before we open it up, what are some of the key strategies specifically that you've implemented to stay ahead of these new threats and risks? I think you've made some points around what you've done, but if you can be a little bit more specific about some of those strategies and what you would recommend to other financial services organizations.
Yeah, I think one of the things that we've done is really looking at our security framework and using things like NIST to measure risk and assess risk and see exactly, where are the things that we need to shore up, or where are the holes, and using security audits directly around that to also supplement that internal assessments. And that really allows us to focus on what we think our project list is going to be for the next year. We're constantly looking over, where are the pieces that we need to protect, and how are we going about that? So doing those internal risk assessments really help us focus on where our budget should be spent. And especially, in times like now, there's more and more threats than there ever has been, and that just continues to escalate. But with all of the uncertainty, there's going to be a lot of companies that are cutting budget and things like that. So it's really, imperative that you know exactly where your risks are, so that you can really target your spend to stay ahead of those things.
Yeah, I think that's a great point. I think, strategies to stay ahead can be a moving target, if you will. It's always kind of comes back to that, you want to trust but verify. And so, going back to your security framework, that AAA mechanism, it's auditing that level of access. You want to give that, you want to give access to what people need, but you also want to figure out a way to secure that. And, Peter Drucker, is famous for saying, you can't manage what you can't measure. So it is really important that you understand how people are using your tools, how people are using software and data, and where that data flow is going. as a registered investment advisor, we're bound to certain levels of compliance, and a big part of what the SEC looks for is that data flow map. So understanding where your data is, classifying your data, that's really important to all of that as well. And many systems don't offer that granularity, the granularity of access. So I can't say I can limit within one system how you might use that system. Some systems are getting smarter about that, right? They're saying, hey, I'm going to add context even to the rights management within something. And so as I authorize you to go into a system, I can give you limited access based on the previous context. And so I can add that extra security context on top of things. Well, if the system doesn't afford that, we have to, as the IT managers, add context and figure out, how am I going to secure this system from compromise? How am I going to secure data loss, right? And so that going back to your framework, it's really applying that level of risk to your security framework and really understanding where your security strategy is going to be applied to minimize that risk. I think it also comes back to establishing those role-based securities I mentioned before. There's a whole bunch of companies out there that help you evaluate your security policy against like a known threat. So you can say, I know I'm protected against this threat. I know I'm protected against that threat. But very few products really help you evaluate your security constraints in real time as risk. CloudKnox is one of those products, right? There's ways that you can automate within the tools to say, these permissions have not been used. Let's go ahead and take them away. Let's right size these permissions without having to have someone come back and review those logs. We can actually right size it and then upsize the permissions as needed. There's mechanisms to do that. And so I think that's the kind of the new strategy that's coming, and not a lot of tools do that today. And I think it's also a huge element that to stay ahead of all this, the threats are changing, right? So that means your security strategy also has to constantly evolve. It's something that it's not a fire and forget process. It's something that you have to constantly mature with. It's something that you have to grow with. You have to evaluate and really reassess your risk. And part of that is that if you will, annual vulnerability test, right? A lot of people adopt this as annual test. Does your vulnerability test include a risk assessment? Does it reevaluate what the threat landscape looks like? Has your internal systems changed your cloud posture, and you need to adopt a new security strategy to make sure that system is protected? So it is really important that you kind of marry all of these elements to have a real security strategy.
And it's a continuous basis. It's not a one-time deal. You don't do a risk assessment and then forget it. I mean, this is a continuous process. We're actually at the almost the 25-minute mark, and I do have one question that you did touch upon. And before we end, I want to ask that. And again, I think you did talk about it a little bit. I think John did. The question is, how would you prioritize your cloud service spend for next year? And I know you alluded to it, but if you have anything specific you can share with the audience, that'd be great.
Yeah, I think we touched on it a little bit. We're looking at our security spend on what is going to minimize our risk profile, and where are those areas at. And I think we're a group that we're planning projects a year out typically. So we're already looking at next year. What are those pieces going to be, and what are the things that are going to keep us most protected? I think continuing to use products like CloudKnox, looking at things that are gonna, as a small shop, things that are gonna automate process for us and automate security, things that allow us to focus on other projects and pieces within enabling the business, are kind of core to our security stance. Joshua, you wanna go in any deeper on that?
Yeah, and I think the other thing that stands out is, we talked about vendor diligence being a key part. We're a smaller firm, so we definitely have help from other IT providers, and those consultants, those managed service providers, and even security providers. I think it's really important that your vendor diligence program is robust, right? It's something that you have to constantly reevaluate. What is the stance of not only their role that I mentioned, right? Establishing that in your security framework, who's responsible, having that accountability element, but also understanding what is their security framework, right? When we talk about if more than half of breaches come from third parties, and we're giving full level administrative access to a third party, we need to evaluate their security posture. We need to make sure that we're staying ahead of what the threats they face, not just our own threats. And so, having a robust vendor management process is really important. And that's something that we constantly evaluate. Again, part of your security posture is that vendor management. And so part of how we've prioritized our budget this year is actually to look at that specifically. Is it something that we need to make stronger? Is it something that we need to make more robust and add some additional automation or even outsource the vendor management process so that somebody else is managing that more on a weekly, monthly basis rather than a semi-annual or quarterly basis. And so it's, again, really important that you prioritize your budget around what gaps you see that you've defined as risk. So if there's gaps in your current security strategy that are there, your budget should be prioritized, especially from a security budget, to make sure you're managing that.
Fantastic. That's a really interesting, I didn't even think about really the vendor management as a top priority, but it makes all the sense in the world when you're talking about third party risks. I do have a question that just popped up. The question is, how do you believe we can collaboratively work against ransomware?
It's a good question. There is a great collaborative community around ransomware today. You look at, WannaCry as an example. One person ends up decoding kind of the key command and control structure of the ransomware, but then shares that publicly. And I think that is still, there are a lot of cybersecurity providers that still try to assist everyone. And there are other examples of ransomware where the keys became known and then became publicly shared. And so you could kind of overcome the decrypt process. I think a key element to how we overcome it as a community is understanding how are we going to start sharing what threats we're facing. Unfortunately, most firms who have a breach don't want to acknowledge it. And unfortunately, that means regulation comes down the pike as a result of us not wanting to communicate with our customers who are now facing that data loss or that data breach. And so, we're now facing regulation from GDPR and CCPA and many other regulations that have come down. And I think that those regulations are specifically tied not just to ransomware, but the idea that we don't want to share as private companies what's going on. And there's got to be a mechanism for us to start sharing that landscape. And a lot of cloud providers are kind of adopting that. So you might see, Palo Alto Networks, CrowdStrike. There's a whole bunch of security vendors out there that are looking to do exactly that. How can we share what the threat landscape looks like, and then start sharing that across their customer base? I know we've talked to the FBI many times. Actually, I don't think it's annual that we've talked to the FBI, mostly from a consulting, I go to conferences that the FBI is presenting in, and we talk about this exact problem. Is the US government really wants us to share our threat model with them. They want to share what threats we're facing with them, but they've never given us necessarily a good mechanism to do that. And I think there's a huge privacy concern around it. And so until that can be overcome, this will always be a challenge. And the vendors are trying to take some of that on. And it's still kind of a race to the finish. There's not a great mechanism for this, and everyone's kind of reinventing the wheel thus far. At least that's my opinion.
All right, fantastic. Okay, looks like we've answered the Q&A. I want to thank you, John and Joshua, for this incredibly interesting and informative discussion. And as I mentioned earlier, this fireside chat will be posted on our website. So on behalf of, actually, I'm going to stop. I think there might be another Q&A. Oh, sorry, we have one more question, so I'm going to hold off. The question is, my organization has formed a red team to combat May's ransomware. A few financial companies have already joined. Any takers here? Opening it up. Okay. All right, we can, we'll take that offline. Thank you. So on behalf of everyone, thank you again. Thanks for joining CloudKnox and Horsley Bridge Partners Fireside Chat, and have a great rest of the day. And more importantly, please stay safe. Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.